The city's skyline loomed like a jagged scar against the twilight, its flickering lights barely piercing the gloom of the shabby district Elara called home. She trudged up the cracked steps of her apartment building, the weight of another long day clinging to her like damp fog. At 22, Elara had grown used to the city's disdain for her kind. Witches, forced to hide their magic in a world ruled by shifters who outlawed it with ruthless precision. Her boots scuffed against the worn concrete, each step echoing in the narrow stairwell. The air was thick with the usual sounds of the neighborhood: distant shouts, a baby's wail, the muffled thump of a neighbor's argument seeping through thin walls. But tonight, something felt off. The building was too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath. Elara's fingers brushed the railing, her heart quickening. Her mother, Celine, and younger sister, Mira, always kept their apartment lit, even during the frequent power outages in this forgotten corner of the city. They'd weave subtle spells, a soft glow of magic to push back the dark. But as Elara reached the third-floor landing, no warm light spilled from under their door. The darkness was absolute, oppressive, swallowing the hallway in a way that made her skin prickle. She paused, her key hovering near the lock. "Mom? Mira?" she called softly, her voice barely a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the silence. No answer came. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she turned the key, the lock clicking with a sound that felt too loud in the quiet. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning like a warning. The apartment was pitch black, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. "No place like home," Elara muttered, wrinkling her nose at the faint musty scent of the old building. She stepped into the entrance hall, her footsteps echoing on the warped floorboards. The darkness seemed to press against her, a living thing that made her magic stir instinctively beneath her skin. She fought the urge to summon a flicker of light. Magic was forbidden, and even a small spell could draw the shifters' attention. They ruled this city with an iron grip, their hatred for witches matched only by their fear. Witches were the outcasts, the hunted, their powers bound to the land yet forbidden to be used. Elara's family had stayed here despite the risks, tethered by magic they couldn't abandon without losing a part of themselves. "Mom? Mira?" she called again, louder this time, her voice swallowed by the void. She moved toward the living room, her hand trailing along the wall for guidance. The silence was wrong, suffocating. Her fingers twitched, a spark of magic begging to ignite, but something in the air, a sharp, predatory edge, made her freeze. She wasn't alone. The realization hit her like a blow, her breath catching as her eyes darted through the shadows. "Mira?" she whispered, her voice trembling now. A faint rustle came from the corner of the room, and her heart lurched. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes adjusting to the dim outlines of furniture. Then she saw it, a shape in the darkness, slumped in the old armchair her mother loved. "Mom!" Elara gasped, rushing forward, her hands outstretched. But before she could reach the figure, a rough hand clamped onto her shoulder, yanking her back with bruising force. A low, guttural voice rasped against her ear, hot and menacing. "Move, and they're dead." The words were a blade, sharp and final, freezing her in place. Elara's breath hitched, her body rigid as the grip tightened. The man's presence was overwhelming, his raw strength radiating like a storm about to break. She caught a glint of golden eyes in the dark, shifter eyes, glowing with predatory intent. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper.
The figure stepped into a sliver of moonlight, filtering through a cracked window, revealing a man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered and muscular, his face carved with hard lines and a cruel smirk. His name was Torren, though she wouldn't learn that until later. "Doesn't matter who I am," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "What matters is what you're going to do for me, witch." The word dripped with contempt, and Elara's stomach twisted. He knew what she was. Her mind raced, panic clawing at her thoughts. Where were her mother and sister? Were they alive? Hurt? The room spun, the darkness closing in as Torren's grip tightened, his breath hot against her neck. "You're going to help me," he continued, his tone leaving no room for refusal, "or your family pays the price." Elara's heart pounded, her magic surging uselessly against the fear that paralyzed her. She was trapped, caught in a web she hadn't seen coming. The shifter's golden eyes bored into hers, unyielding, promising violence if she dared resist. In that moment, Elara knew her life was no longer her own. The darkness wasn't just in the apartment, it was in her future, and it was only beginning. The air in Elara's apartment was thick with dread, the darkness wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. Torren's hand still gripped her shoulder, his fingers digging into her skin with a strength that promised pain if she resisted. His golden eyes gleamed in the faint moonlight, predatory and unyielding, pinning her in place as her heart thundered in her chest. The word witch still hung between them, sharp and accusing, a reminder of how exposed she was. Elara's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and desperation. Where were her mother and sister? What did the shifter want from her? The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, until Torren's voice cut through it like a blade. "Your mother and sister are alive," he said, his tone cold and deliberate, as if he were discussing the weather. "For now." Elara's breath hitched, a spark of hope warring with the terror clawing at her insides. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling, despite her efforts to keep it steady. Torren's smirk widened, his teeth glinting in the dim light, more beast than man. "You're going to help me take down my brother," he said, his words dripping with venom. "Cassian, the alpha of our pack. You'll get close to him, earn his trust, and report back to me. Every move, every word, every weakness." Delara's stomach churned, the weight of his demands sinking in. Cassian, the Alpha, was a name whispered in fear and awe across the city. A shifter of unmatched power, ruling with an iron will. She'd never met him, but the stories painted him as untouchable, a force of nature who despised witches as much as any shifter. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm nobody, a witch in hiding. He'd never trust me." Torren's grip tightened, making her wince. "That's where you're wrong," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're exactly what I need, a nobody who can slip through the cracks. And I know your kind can mask your scent, make yourself seem less like the abomination you are." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small glass vial, its contents shimmering faintly with an unnatural glow. "This," he said, holding it up, "will make you smell like one of us. A shifter. Weak, maybe, but close enough to fool him." Elara stared at the vial, her heart sinking. A potion to hide her witch's scent. She knew such spells existed, but they were dangerous, unstable, and forbidden even among her kind. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Torren's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Your mother and sister won't see another sunrise. I've got them locked away, and my men aren't known for their patience." Elara's knees buckled, but she forced herself to stand tall, her nails digging into her palms. The thought of Celine and Mira, bound, terrified, at the mercy of shifters, made her chest ache with a pain so sharp it stole her breath. "I'll do it," she said, her voice cracking. "But I need proof they're alive." Torren chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Good girl," he said, pulling a small, crumpled photograph from his pocket and tossing it at her feet. Elara knelt, her hands trembling as she picked it up. The image showed Celine and Mira, gagged and tied to chairs in a dimly lit room, their eyes wide with fear. A sob caught in Elara's throat, but she swallowed it, refusing to let Torren see her break. "Good," Torren said, satisfied. "But we're not done. You'll swear a magical oath to seal the deal." Elara's blood ran cold. A magical oath was a binding spell, a sacred vow among witches that couldn't be broken without deadly consequences. To swear one was to chain her soul to his will, betray him, and she'd die. "You can't ask that," she whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Torren stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow that swallowed her. "You don't get to say no," he growled. "Swear it or I'll gut your family right now." Elara's vision blurred with tears, but she forced them back. She had no choice. Closing her eyes, she reached for the magic buried deep within her, the spark she'd spent years suppressing to survive in this city. It surged to life, warm and wild, and she spoke the words of the oath, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I, Elara, swear by my magic to obey your command, to spy on Cassian and report to you, and to keep our pact secret, on pain of death." The air shimmered as the spell took hold, a cold weight settling around her heart, binding her to Torren's will. She gasped, the sensation like chains tightening around her soul. Torren's smirk returned, triumphant. "Good girl," he said, tossing the vial into her hands. "Put that on. You're coming with me." Elara clutched the vial, its glass cold against her skin. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none, not yet. She uncorked the vial, the potion's faint glow casting eerie shadows across the room. With a trembling hand, she dabbed it on her wrists and neck, the scent of earth and musk replacing her natural witch's aura. It felt like betraying herself, but she had no choice. Not if she wanted to save her family. As Torren led her out of the apartment, the darkness seemed to follow, a reminder of the path she was now forced to walk. She was no longer just Elara, the hidden witch struggling to survive. She was a pawn in a shifter's game, bound by magic and fear, with her family's lives hanging in the balance. The city's lights flickered in the distance as they stepped into the night, and Elara knew that whatever lay ahead, it would test every ounce of her strength and cunning. The gravel crunched under Elara's boots as Torren's sleek black car pulled up to a sprawling estate, its towering gates glinting under the moonlight. The mansion loomed ahead, a fortress of stone and glass nestled in a dense forest, far from the city's grime where Elara had spent her life hiding. Her heart pounded, the magical oath still a cold weight around her soul, binding her to Torren's will. The vial of potion hung heavy around her neck, its faint glow hidden beneath her collar, masking her witch's scent with the musky earthiness of a shifter. She clutched the door handle, her knuckles white, as Torren stepped out, his golden eyes glinting with smug satisfaction. "Welcome to your new home," he said, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver down her spine. "Don't get comfortable." Elara followed him through the gates, her steps faltering as the mansion's grandeur came into full view. Marble columns flanked the entrance, and chandeliers cast golden light through towering windows. It was a world apart from her run-down apartment, where cracked walls and flickering lights were the norm. But the opulence felt like a cage, each polished surface a reminder of her captivity. Torren led her inside, his heavy boots echoing on the gleaming floors. Servants moved silently, their eyes averted, but Elara felt their glances, sharp, curious, and laced with suspicion. She kept her head down, her long black hair falling like a curtain to shield her face. She couldn't afford to draw attention, not if she wanted to survive.
Torren stopped in a vast hall, its centerpiece a grand piano that gleamed like a dark jewel under the soft glow of a chandelier. "This," he said, gesturing to the instrument, "is your key to Cassian. He's got a soft spot for music, some sentimental nonsense about his late mate. You'll play for him, charm him, make him think you're harmless." Elara's stomach twisted. She hadn't touched a piano since she was a child, and even then her skills were rudimentary at best. "I don't know how to play," she said, her voice low, hoping to find a crack in his plan. Torren's smirk was cold, predatory. "You're a witch, aren't you? Figure it out. Use your magic, discreetly. If anyone suspects what you are, your family's blood is on your hands." Her breath caught, the image of her mother and sister, bound and terrified in that photograph, flashing through her mind. She nodded, swallowing the fear that threatened to choke her. Torren handed her a stack of sheet music, the pages worn but meticulously annotated. "Learn this," he ordered. "It's the piece he loves. You've got 3 days before you meet him. Don't disappoint me." He turned and left, his footsteps fading into the vastness of the estate, leaving Elara alone with the piano and the weight of her impossible task. She approached the instrument, her fingers trembling as she touched the cool, smooth keys. The silence of the hall pressed against her, broken only by the distant hum of the forest outside. She sat on the bench, her heart racing. Magic was her only hope, but using it here in a shifter's stronghold was like dancing on a razor's edge. Closing her eyes, she reached for the spark within her, the warm pulse of power she'd spent years suppressing. It stirred, hesitant at first, then flowed through her fingertips, guiding her hands over the keys. The notes came haltingly, clumsy, but her magic wove through them, sharpening her memory, steadying her movements. The melody began to take shape, a haunting, mournful tune that seemed to echo her own fear and longing. Hours passed, the music becoming her anchor in this strange, hostile place. But with each note, her inner turmoil grew. She was no longer just Elara, the witch hiding in the shadows. She was a spy, a liar, forced to deceive a man she'd never met to save the only people she loved. The estate's luxury was a cruel contrast to her reality. Every glittering chandelier, every plush rug, a reminder of the freedom she'd lost. She thought of her mother's gentle smile, Mira's infectious laugh, and the ache in her chest deepened. Were they safe? Were they suffering? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she pushed it down, focusing on the music. She had to be perfect. She had to survive. A servant appeared, a young woman with sharp eyes and a clipped voice. "You'll stay in the east wing," she said, barely glancing at Elara. "Follow me." Elara rose, her legs stiff from hours at the piano, and trailed the servant through winding corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced shifters. The air was thick with their scent, wild, primal, a constant reminder of the danger surrounding her. Her room was small but lavish, with a 4-poster bed and heavy curtains that blocked out the world. The servant left without a word, and Elara sank onto the bed, clutching the vial around her neck. The potion's faint glow pulsed like a heartbeat, a lifeline, and a chain all at once.
Alone in the silence, Elara's thoughts spiraled. Torren's plan was madness. How could she, a witch, fool an alpha like Cassian? Shifters could sense lies, smell fear. One slip and she'd be dead, her family along with her. Yet the magical oath bound her, its invisible chains tightening with every doubt. She closed her eyes, the melody from the piano still echoing in her mind. It was her weapon, her disguise, and her only hope of navigating this new prison. As the forest whispered beyond the window, Elara steeled herself. She would play the part, charm the alpha, and find a way to break free. But deep down, she knew the cost of failure was more than she could bear. The grand hall of Torren's estate was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, the chandelier above casting intricate shadows across the polished marble floor. Elara sat at the grand piano, her fingers poised over the keys, the weight of her task pressing down on her like a storm cloud. 3 days had passed since Torren's chilling ultimatum, and tonight was the night she would meet Cassian, the alpha of the shifter pack. The potion vial around her neck felt heavier than ever, its faint glow hidden beneath the high collar of the elegant gown Torren had insisted she wear. The fabric, a deep emerald that clung to her frame, felt foreign, like a costume for a role she wasn't ready to play. Her heart thudded as she glanced at the clock, 9 p.m. sharp. It was time. She began to play, the haunting melody she'd practiced endlessly, spilling from the piano, each note laced with the subtle magic she'd used to master it. The music filled the hall, its mournful cadence echoing her own fear and resolve. She kept her eyes on the keys, afraid to look up, afraid of what she might see in the alpha's gaze. Torren had warned her. Cassian was a force of nature, a man whose presence could unravel even the strongest will. Her job was to charm him, to become his confidant, all while hiding the truth of her witch heritage. The magical oath bound her to this deception, its invisible chains tightening with every breath. Footsteps echoed behind her, heavy and deliberate, and Elara's pulse quickened. She didn't turn, focusing instead on the music, letting it anchor her as the air grew thick with a new presence. Cassian. She could feel him without looking. His energy was a storm, powerful and unyielding, filling the room like a predator staking its claim. The notes faltered for a split second, but she caught herself, her magic steadying her hands. She sensed him stop a few feet away, his silence more unnerving than any words. The melody reached its crescendo, and as the final note faded, the hall fell into a heavy stillness, broken only by a single, slow clap. Elara turned, her breath catching as she met Cassian's gaze. He was taller than she'd imagined, his broad frame clad in a tailored black suit that did little to soften the raw power radiating from him. His hair, streaked with silver, framed a face carved with hard lines, and his dark eyes, almost black in the dim light, seemed to pierce through her, searching for something she couldn't name. He was in his early 50s, but there was nothing soft or aged about him. He was a blade, sharp and unyielding. He said, his voice low and gruff, carrying a weight that made her skin prickle. "You play well. Where did you learn?"
Elara swallowed, her throat dry. "I taught myself," she lied, keeping her voice soft, submissive as Torren had instructed. "It's been a comfort." Cassian's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment she feared he'd sensed the lie. But he only nodded, stepping closer, his gaze never leaving her. "It's a rare skill," he said, his tone unreadable. "It reminds me of someone I once knew." His words were clipped, but there was a flicker of something, pain perhaps, beneath the surface. Elara seized on it, her instincts as a spy kicking in. "Someone important?" she asked, her voice gentle, testing the waters. Cassian's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she'd overstepped, but he didn't snap or turn away. Instead, he moved to the window, his back to her, staring out at the dark forest beyond. "My mate," he said, his voice quieter now, almost distant. "She used to play that piece. You capture its essence." Elara's heart skipped. This was the vulnerability Torren had hinted at, the crack in Cassian's armor she was meant to exploit. But the weight of his words, the raw grief in them, stirred something in her. Guilt, unwanted and sharp. She was here to deceive him, to use his pain against him, and the thought made her stomach twist. She rose from the piano bench, smoothing her gown to steady her nerves. "I'm honored to play it for you, Alpha," she said, bowing her head slightly, the picture of deference. But inside, her mind raced. Cassian was guarded, his every word measured, his demeanor a fortress she wasn't sure she could breach. How was she supposed to earn his trust when he seemed to see through everything? "Play it again," he said, suddenly, turning back to her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Elara nodded, returning to the piano, her fingers trembling as she began the melody once more. The music flowed, but her thoughts were a storm. Cassian's fascination with her playing was her way in, but it also made her feel exposed, like he was searching for something beyond the notes. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy and unrelenting, as if he were trying to unravel her soul. The magical oath pulsed in her chest, a reminder of Torren's threat. Fail, and her family would suffer. She pushed the fear down, letting the music carry her, but the tension in the room was palpable, a dance of power and deception. As the final notes faded, Cassian spoke again, his voice softer but no less commanding. "You'll stay here, in the pack house. I want to hear you play again." Elara's heart sank. The pack house, Cassian's domain, would be even more dangerous, surrounded by shifters who could smell a lie. But she forced a smile, nodding. "Thank you, Alpha," she murmured, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. Cassian gave her one last searching look before turning and leaving the hall, his footsteps echoing like a warning. Elara sat frozen, her hands still on the keys. She was deeper in the lion's den now, her role as a spy more precarious than ever. Cassian's hidden vulnerability was her only leverage, but exploiting it felt like betraying something human in herself. The forest outside whispered through the open window, and Elara clutched the vial around her neck, its glow a faint pulse against her skin. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, and the Alpha's shadow loomed larger than she ever imagined. The dining hall of the pack house shimmered with opulence, its long oak table laden with silver platters of roasted meats, fresh bread, and vibrant fruits. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow, but the atmosphere was anything but inviting for Elara. She sat near the middle of the table, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The potion vial around her neck felt like a lead weight, its faint glow concealed beneath her high-collared dress. For a week she'd been playing her part, Cassian's quiet songbird, performing haunting melodies on the piano to soften the Alpha's guarded heart. But every note she played for him, every submissive nod, tightened the magical oath binding her to Torren's cruel demands. Her family's lives hung in the balance, and the pressure was a constant ache in her chest. The hall buzzed with the low hum of pack members' conversations, their eyes occasionally flicking toward Elara with thinly veiled suspicion. She kept her gaze down, picking at her food, trying to blend into the background. Cassian sat at the head of the table, his stern presence silencing any chatter that grew too loud.
Torren, seated to his right, watched Elara with a predatory smirk that made her skin crawl. She could feel his gaze, a reminder of her role as his spy, tasked with uncovering Cassian's weaknesses. The weight of it all was suffocating, but she forced herself to breathe, to focus, to survive. The heavy oak doors swung open with a bang, shattering the tense quiet. All heads turned as a young man strode in, his presence like a spark igniting dry tinder. Jaxon, Cassian's estranged son, was impossible to ignore. He was in his mid-20s, tall and lean, with tousled dark hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to see everything and care about nothing. His leather jacket was scuffed, his shirt slightly wrinkled, as though he'd just rolled out of a bar fight or a late-night bender. Yet his movements were sharp, deliberate, carrying a restless energy that made the air crackle. Elara's breath caught as his gaze swept the room, landing on her with an intensity that pinned her to her seat. "Well, well," Jaxon drawled, his voice laced with mockery as he leaned against the doorframe. Cassian's jaw tightened, his dark eyes narrowing. "You're late, Jaxon," he said, his tone cold and commanding. "Sit." Jaxon smirked, undeterred, and sauntered to an empty chair directly across from Elara, dropping into it with a casual arrogance that made the room bristle. "Nice to see you too, Dad," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm.
Elara's pulse quickened as Jackson's gaze locked onto her again, his green eyes sharp and probing. "And who's this?" he asked, tilting his head, his tone deceptively light but edged with suspicion. "Your new pet project?" The words stung, and Elara felt a flush creep up her neck. She forced her expression to remain neutral, her voice soft but steady. "I'm Elara," she said, meeting his gaze briefly before lowering her eyes as a submissive shifter would. "I'm a guest of the Alphas." Jackson's smirk widened, but there was no warmth in it. "A guest," he repeated, leaning back in his chair. "Right, because my father's known for his hospitality." Cassian's hand slammed on the table, the sound sharp enough to make Elara flinch. "Enough," he growled, his eyes boring into Jaxon. "Show some respect." Jaxon raised an eyebrow, unfazed, and took a slow sip of water, his gaze never leaving Elara. The tension between father and son was palpable, a storm brewing in the silence, but Elara felt caught in its center. Jackson's suspicion was a threat. She couldn't afford to have him digging into her story, not when her witch identity was a death sentence. Torren cleared his throat, his voice smooth and calculated. "Elara's been a welcome addition," he said, his smirk directed at her now. "She plays the piano beautifully. It soothes the Alpha's nerves." Elara's stomach twisted at the veiled threat in his words, a reminder of her role as his pawn. Jackson's eyes narrowed, flicking between Torren and Elara, as if piecing together a puzzle. "Is that so?" he said, his tone laced with disbelief. "Guess I'll have to hear it for myself." The meal continued in uneasy silence, broken only by the clink of silverware and the occasional murmur of pack business. Elara kept her head down, but she could feel Jackson's gaze on her, relentless and searching. It wasn't just suspicion. She sensed curiosity, maybe even something else, something that made her heart skip in a way she didn't want to acknowledge. When the dinner ended, she rose to leave, desperate for the sanctuary of her room, but Jackson's voice stopped her. "Elara," he called, his tone casual but commanding. She turned, her heart pounding. He was leaning against the table now, his green eyes glinting with a mix of challenge and intrigue. "Play something for me later. I'm curious about Dad's new favorite." Elara forced a small smile, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Of course," she said, bowing her head slightly before slipping out of the hall. Her footsteps echoed in the corridor, but her mind was racing. Jackson's return had upended everything. His rebellious attitude and sharp instincts were a danger she hadn't anticipated.
Yet there was something in the way he looked at her, not just suspicion, but a spark of connection that both unsettled and intrigued her. She clutched the vial around her neck, its glow a faint pulse against her skin. Her mission to charm Cassian was daunting enough, but Jaxon's presence added a new layer of complexity. As she reached her room, the weight of her deception settled heavier than ever. She was a witch in a den of wolves, and Jaxon's green eyes seemed determined to see right through her.
The pack house was a labyrinth of power and pretense. Its polished halls and flickering chandeliers a stark contrast to the danger lurking beneath. Elara moved through it like a ghost, her every step calculated to avoid notice. 2 weeks had passed since her arrival, and she'd honed her role as the submissive shifter, her witch identity buried beneath the musky scent and a carefully crafted facade. The vial around her neck was a constant reminder of her precarious position, its faint glow hidden under her high-necked dress. Each night, she played the piano for Cassian, the alpha, weaving haunting melodies that softened his stern demeanor. But with every note, the magical oath binding her to Torren tightened, a cold chain around her heart, urging her to betray the man who was beginning to trust her. Tonight, the grand hall was quieter than usual, the pack members dispersed after a tense dinner. Elara sat at the piano, her fingers gliding over the keys, the familiar mournful tune filling the air. Cassian stood by the window, his broad silhouette framed against the dark forest beyond. His dark eyes, usually so unyielding, softened as the music washed over him, and Elara felt a pang of guilt. She was here to exploit his vulnerabilities, to feed Torren's secrets that could topple him, yet his rare moments of openness made her question her resolve. "You play with such feeling," Cassian said, his voice low, almost wistful. "It's as if you understand loss." Elara's fingers faltered for a heartbeat, but she recovered, her magic steadying her hands. "I've known my share," she murmured, keeping her eyes on the keys, afraid he'd see the truth in her gaze. Before Cassian could respond, a shadow loomed in the doorway. Torren's presence was like a cold wind, his golden eyes glinting with impatience. "Alpha, a word," he said, his tone smooth but edged with authority. Cassian nodded, casting Elara a brief, unreadable glance before following Torren out. The moment they were gone, Elara's shoulders sagged, the weight of her deception pressing down. She was walking a tightrope, and Torren's demands were growing sharper. Earlier that day, he'd cornered her in a quiet corridor, his voice a low hiss. "You're not moving fast enough," he'd snapped. "Cassian trusts you, but I need more. His plans, his weaknesses, anything I can use. Don't forget what's at stake." The memory of her mother and sister, bound and terrified in that photograph, haunted her, driving her to comply. As she rose from the piano, the sound of footsteps made her tense. Jaxon, Cassian's rebellious son, leaned against the doorframe, his green eyes sharp and probing. His dark hair was tousled, his leather jacket slung carelessly over one shoulder, but there was nothing careless about the way he watched her. "Another private concert for the Alpha?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. Elara forced a calm smile, her heart racing. Jaxon's suspicion was a constant threat, his questions like arrows aimed at her carefully constructed lies. "He enjoys the music," she said softly, smoothing her dress to hide her trembling hands. "It's harmless." Jaxon stepped closer, his smirk fading. "Harmless," he repeated, his tone skeptical. "You're too good at this, Elara. Too perfect. What's your game?" Her breath caught, the vial around her neck feeling like a noose. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. Jaxon tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle he was determined to solve.
"You're not like the others around here," he said, his voice lower now, almost curious. "You don't grovel, but you play the part so well. Why is that?" Elara's mind raced for an answer that wouldn't unravel her cover. "I'm just trying to survive," she said, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. For a moment, Jaxon's expression softened, a flicker of something, empathy perhaps, crossing his face, but then his smirk returned, sharp and challenging. "Survival's a funny thing," he said, stepping closer still, his voice dropping to a murmur. "It makes people do things they'd rather not, like lying to an alpha." Elara's heart pounded, her magic stirring instinctively, but she forced it down. She couldn't react, not when Jaxon's green eyes seemed to see right through her. "I'm not lying," she said, meeting his gaze, her voice firm despite the panic clawing at her chest. "I'm just here." Jaxon chuckled, a low, rich sound that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Sure you are," he said, his tone teasing but his eyes serious. "But I'll figure you out, songbird." The nickname, laced with both mockery and intrigue, made her cheeks flush, and she hated herself for it. She turned away, pretending to adjust the sheet music, but Jaxon's presence lingered, a mix of threat and fascination that she couldn't shake. "See you around," he said, his footsteps fading as he left the hall. Elara exhaled shakily, her hands gripping the edge of the piano. Jaxon's probing questions were a danger she hadn't anticipated, each one a crack in her fragile facade. She was caught between Cassian's growing trust, Torren's relentless pressure, and Jaxon's unsettling curiosity. The pack's hierarchy was a maze of power and betrayal, and she was trapped at its center. As she sat back down, her fingers hovering over the keys, the melody felt like a chain, binding her to a role she couldn't escape. The forest outside whispered through the open window, a reminder of the freedom she'd lost. She had to keep playing the part, but with Jaxon watching and Torren's demands tightening, Elara knew her precarious position was growing more dangerous by the day.
The pack-house was a gilded cage, its opulent halls suffocating under the weight of unspoken tensions. Elara slipped through a side corridor, her footsteps muffled on the plush rug, her heart pounding with the strain of her double life. 3 weeks had passed since she'd been thrust into Torren's scheme, bound by a magical oath to spy on Cassian, the Alpha, while masking her witch identity with a potion that clung to her skin like a lie. Her piano performances had drawn Cassian closer, his guarded trust a fragile thread she dangled from. But Torren's demands were relentless, and Jaxon's piercing green eyes seemed to see through her every move. The vial around her neck pulsed faintly, a constant reminder of the danger she was in, and the lives of her mother and sister hanging in the balance. She reached the library, seeking a moment of solitude to steady her fraying nerves. The room was dimly lit, shelves of leather-bound books stretching to the ceiling, their musty scent a faint comfort. She sank into an armchair, her fingers brushing the vial hidden beneath her dress, when the door creaked open. Jaxon stood there, his lean frame filling the doorway, his dark hair tousled, and his leather jacket slung carelessly over one shoulder. His green eyes locked onto hers, sharp and unyielding, a smirk playing on his lips. "Hiding, songbird?" he asked, his voice low and teasing, but with an edge that made her pulse quicken. Elara straightened, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "I just needed a moment," she said, her tone light but guarded. "What do you want, Jaxon?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click that echoed like a warning. "You," he said simply, his smirk fading as he crossed the room, stopping just close enough to make the air between them crackle. "You're hiding something, Elara, and I'm not the only one who's noticed."
Her heart lurched, but she kept her expression neutral, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steadied despite the panic rising in her chest.
Jaxon tilted his head, studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. "Don't play dumb," he said, his tone softer now, but no less dangerous. "You're too careful, too perfect. Nobody just fits into this place the way you do, not without a reason." He took another step closer, his gaze never leaving hers, and Elara felt a strange pull, part fear, part something else she didn't want to name. "I'm just trying to survive," she said, echoing her words from their last encounter, hoping to deflect him. But Jackson's eyes narrowed, his smirk returning, sharper this time. "Survive," he repeated, leaning in until his face was inches from hers. "That's a dangerous game, Songbird, and you're playing it with the wrong people." Her breath caught, the warmth of his presence sending an unwanted shiver down her spine. She should push him away, shut this down, but there was something in his gaze, not just suspicion, but a flicker of fascination that mirrored her own. "And what about you?" she countered, her voice low, daring. "You're not exactly the loyal son, are you? What's your game, Jaxon?" His smirk faltered, a shadow crossing his face, and for a moment she saw something raw, unguarded. "Maybe I'm just tired of being my father's pawn," he said, his voice quieter, almost vulnerable. "But you're something else entirely." Before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door made them both tense. Torren's voice cut through the wood, cold and commanding. "Elara, outside, now!" Her stomach twisted, the magical oath tightening like a noose. Jaxon stepped back, his expression hardening, but his eyes lingered on her, searching. "Better not keep him waiting," he said, his tone laced with mockery, but there was a warning in his gaze. Elara rose, smoothing her dress, her heart pounding as she moved toward the door. She felt Jackson's eyes on her back, a weight she couldn't shake.
Torren stood in the corridor, his golden eyes glinting with impatience. "You're slipping," he hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her into a shadowed alcove. "Cassian's starting to trust you, but I need more. His plans for the Pack's expansion, his alliances. Get me something I can use, or your family pays the price." Elara's throat tightened, the image of her mother and sister flashing through her mind. "I'm trying," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "He doesn't just spill secrets." Torren's grip tightened, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Then make him. Use that pretty face, that music he loves. Manipulate him, or I'll make sure you regret it." He released her, stepping back with a cold smirk, and Elara fought to steady her breathing. As Torren walked away, she leaned against the wall, her mind racing. Jackson's suspicions were a growing threat, his probing questions chipping away at her facade. But his presence stirred something in her, a spark of defiance, a dangerous attraction she couldn't afford. Cassian's trust was her only leverage, but manipulating him meant sinking deeper into Torren's web. The library door creaked open behind her, and Jackson's voice was soft but pointed. "Careful, Songbird. Whatever you're tangled up in, it's gonna burn you if you don't watch your step." Elara met his gaze, her heart thrumming with a mix of fear and resolve. "Maybe I'm not the only one who needs to watch their step," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside. Jackson's lips twitched, a hint of admiration in his eyes, before he turned and disappeared down the hall.
Alone, Elara clutched the vial around her neck, its glow a faint pulse against her skin. The game was getting more dangerous, and with Jaxon's scrutiny and Torren's pressure closing in, she knew one wrong move could cost her everything. The pack house's music room was bathed in the soft flicker of candlelight, the grand piano standing like a sentinel in the center. Elara sat at the bench, her fingers dancing over the keys with a grace born of desperate practice and subtle magic. The haunting melody filled the air, its notes weaving a tapestry of sorrow and longing that mirrored her own turmoil. 4 weeks had slipped by since Torren's iron grip had forced her into this deceptive role, and the magical oath binding her soul felt heavier with each passing day. The potion vial around her neck pulsed faintly, masking her witch's essence, but the strain of her facade was beginning to show, cracks forming in the mask she wore to survive. Cassian stood by the fireplace, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the room. His dark eyes, usually so impenetrable, held a rare softness as he listened. The Alpha had summoned her here more frequently lately, his stern demeanor cracking just enough to reveal glimpses of the man beneath. As the final note faded into silence, he spoke, his voice gruff, but laced with an emotion Elara hadn't heard before. That piece, it never fails to stir something in me. Elara lowered her hands, her heart pounding. She turned to face him, keeping her expression demure. "I'm glad it brings you comfort, Alpha," she said softly, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside.
Cassian moved closer, his heavy steps echoing on the wooden floor. He hesitated, then sat on the edge of the bench beside her, an uncharacteristic vulnerability in his posture. "It's more than comfort," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the keys. "My mate, Elara, she played it just like you do. Every note, every pause. It was her way of speaking what words couldn't." Elara's breath caught, the weight of his confession hitting her like a wave. She'd suspected as much from his earlier hints, but hearing it now, raw and unfiltered, stirred a deep empathy she couldn't afford. Cassian's mate had been gone for years, lost to some tragedy the pack whispered about but never named. "She was taken from me too soon," he continued, his voice rough with suppressed grief. "Arrayed by rival shifters, I couldn't protect her. The music, it's all I have left." Elara's chest ached, guilt twisting like a knife. She was here to exploit this very pain, to pry secrets from him for Torren, but Cassian's openness made her feel like the monster the shifters accused witches of being. "I'm sorry," she whispered, genuine sorrow in her words. "Loss like that, it changes everything." Cassian nodded, his dark eyes meeting hers for a moment, searching. "It does, and you've brought a piece of her back to me. Thank you, Elara." The trust in his voice was a double-edged sword, her mission advancing, but at the cost of her conscience. She forced a small smile, her fingers brushing the keys as if to anchor herself. But the moment shattered when a servant entered, bowing low. "A message for you, miss," he said, handing her a small sealed envelope before retreating. Elara's hands trembled as she opened it, her eyes scanning the cryptic words scrawled in a familiar hand, her mother's. "The shadows grow longer. Find the hidden path before the moon fades. We endure, but hurry."
Her heart raced, the message a desperate plea, urging her to escape Torren's clutches. How had it reached her? Was it a trap? She tucked it away quickly, her mind spinning with urgency. Her family was alive, but suffering, and time was running out. Later that night, as Elara paced her room, the door burst open. Torren stormed in, his golden eyes blazing with fury. "What did he tell you?" he demanded, grabbing her arm with bruising force. Elara winced, but held her ground. "Nothing useful yet," she said, her voice steady. "He's opening up, but slowly." Torren's grip tightened, his face inches from hers. He snarled, "Slowly isn't good enough. I need his weaknesses, now. The pack's alliances are shifting, and if you don't deliver, I'll make sure your mother and sister pay in ways you can't imagine." He shoved her back, his threats intensifying like a storm building. "Cut their rations, break their spirits, whatever it takes. You've got 1 week, witch, or they're dead." Elara's knees buckled as he left, slamming the door behind him. She sank to the floor, the cryptic message clutched in her hand, tears blurring her vision. The emotional depth of Cassian's confession clashed with Torren's cruelty, heightening the urgency of her plight. She was cracking under the pressure, her facade fracturing as the stakes escalated. Jaxon's suspicions lingered in her mind, an ally or another threat, but she couldn't trust anyone, not yet. The moon outside waned, a silent timer ticking down. She had to find a way out, to save her family and herself before everything shattered beyond repair.
The pack house was a powder keg, its opulent halls humming with unspoken threats as the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the arched windows. Elara's heart pounded as she slipped through a narrow corridor, her fingers brushing the potion vial around her neck, its faint glow a lifeline masking her witch's scent. 5 weeks had passed since Torren's magical oath had bound her to his will, forcing her to spy on Cassian, the Alpha, while her mother and sister languished in captivity. The cryptic message from her family, "Find the hidden path before the moon fades," burned in her mind, a desperate plea that drove her to take risks she couldn't afford. Torren's threats had grown more vicious, his deadline looming like a guillotine, and Jaxon's relentless scrutiny was a blade at her throat. Tonight, everything was about to break. Elara had been summoned to Torren's private study, a room tucked deep within the estate's labyrinthine corridors. She moved silently, her pulse racing as she approached the heavy oak door, left slightly ajar. Torren's voice spilled out, low and venomous, speaking to someone unseen. "Cassian's blind to the pack's unrest," he growled. "His alliances with the northern clans are weak, and he's too stubborn to see it. Once I expose his failures, the pack will turn, and I'll take his place." Elara froze, her breath catching. This was the leverage Torren had been pushing her to uncover, proof of his betrayal, but hearing it firsthand sent a chill down her spine. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to listen, when a floorboard creaked behind her. She spun, her heart lurching, as Jaxon emerged from the shadows, his green eyes glinting with a mix of suspicion and urgency. "Eavesdropping, songbird," he whispered, his voice low but sharp, his leather jacket catching the faint moonlight. Elara's stomach twisted. She was caught,
her cover teetering on the edge of collapse. I wasn't, but Jaxon stepped closer, his gaze cutting through her lie. "Don't," he said, his tone firm but not cruel. "I heard him too, and I know you're not here by choice." Her breath hitched, the vial around her neck feeling like a noose. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay composed. Jaxon's eyes narrowed, searching hers. "I've been watching you, Elara. The way you move, the way you watch everyone. Too careful, too scared. You're no shifter." Her heart stopped, the truth exposed in a single sentence. She opened her mouth to deny it, but Jaxon held up a hand, his expression softening. "I'm not going to turn you in," he said, his voice low, almost gentle. "I heard Torren threaten you last week, about your family. You're his pawn, aren't you? A witch, forced to spy on my father." Elara's knees buckled, but she steadied herself against the wall, her mind racing. He knew the game was over, unless he meant what he said.
"Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, fear and hope warring within her. Jackson's jaw tightened, a shadow crossing his face. "Because I'm done with this pack's games. My father's blind to Torren's schemes, and I'm tired of being caught in the middle. If Torren's planning a coup, we can stop him, together." Elara stared at him, her heart pounding. Trusting Jaxon was a gamble that could cost her everything, but his discontent with the pack's leadership mirrored her own desperation. The cryptic message from her family echoed in her mind, the hidden path, and she wondered if Jaxon could be part of it. Before she could respond, Torren's voice grew louder, his footsteps approaching the door. Jaxon grabbed her arm, pulling her into a shadowed alcove, his body pressed close to hers to avoid detection. "Say yes, Elara," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear, sending an unexpected shiver through her. Her pulse raced, the chemistry between them undeniable, a dangerous spark that could either save her or burn her alive. She nodded, her voice barely audible. "Okay, I'm in." Jackson's eyes flashed with something like relief, but the moment was cut short as Torren emerged, his golden eyes scanning the corridor. Elara held her breath, her body pressed against Jackson's, the vial's glow hidden in the shadows. Torren passed without noticing them, his footsteps fading, but the danger lingered. Jaxon released her, stepping back, his expression serious. "Meet me at the old oak by the eastern gate at midnight. We'll figure out where your family's being held and expose Torren before he makes his move." Elara nodded, her mind reeling with the weight of her decision. Trusting Jaxon was a leap into the unknown, but it was her only chance to break free. As Jaxon slipped away, Elara clutched the vial, its faint pulse a reminder of her fragile hope. The stakes were never higher. Torren's betrayal was out in the open, but so was her secret. Jackson's offer was a lifeline, but it came with risks she couldn't ignore. The moon outside was a sliver, its light fading, urging her to act. This was the climax of her deception, the moment where everything could either unravel or resolve. With Jaxon by her side, she might just find the hidden path to save her family and herself. The forest around the pack house was a sea of shadows, the waning moon casting a faint silver glow through the tangled branches. Elara crouched beside Jaxon under the gnarled branches of the old oak by the eastern gate, her breath shallow, the cold night air stinging her cheeks. The potion vial around her neck pulsed faintly, its glow tucked beneath her cloak, but the magical oath that had bound her to Torren was fraying, its chains weakening with every step toward rebellion. Jackson's green eyes burned with resolve, his leather jacket blending into the darkness. "Ready, songbird?" he whispered, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her nerves. Elara nodded, her fingers clutching the cryptic message from her family. Find the hidden path, now a beacon guiding her to their freedom. Tonight, they would outmaneuver Torren, save her mother and sister, and expose his plot to overthrow Cassian. The stakes were life or death, and there was no turning back. Their plan, forged in the tense hours after Jaxon overheard Torren's treacherous scheme, was a high-stakes gamble. Jaxon had traced Torren's encrypted messages, pinpointing the old hunting lodge where Selene and Mira were held, guarded by his loyal shifters. His insider knowledge of the pack's operations was their only advantage, but the danger was palpable. They moved through the forest like ghosts, Jaxon's instincts guiding them, a stolen key clutched in his hand. Elara's magic hummed beneath her skin, a subtle spark she used to heighten her senses, catching the faint musk of shifters ahead. 2 guards, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Jaxon's hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that steadied her racing heart, though she pushed the feeling aside. The lodge emerged from the pines, its weathered boards creaking in the wind. Jaxon dispatched the guards with swift, silent precision, his shifter strength a blur under the moonlight. Inside, Elara's heart lurched as she saw Selene and Mira, bound and pale, their eyes lighting with hope at the sight of her. "Elara," Selene whispered, her voice breaking as Elara cut their ropes. Mira threw her arms around her, trembling, and Elara's resolve hardened. "We're leaving," she vowed, her voice fierce despite the tears welling in her eyes. Jaxon stood guard, his gaze scanning the darkness, every muscle tensed for a fight. But Torren was a predator with a hunter's instincts. As they slipped back toward the pack house, his golden eyes glimmed from the shadows, his voice a venomous snarl. "You dare betray me, witch?" he growled, flanked by 3 shifters, their eyes glowing with menace. Elara's heart plummeted, the oath's remnants squeezing her chest. But Jaxon stepped forward, his stance unyielding. "She's not yours to control," he said, his voice icy. "And your time's up, Torren." He brandished a recorder, its playback echoing Torren's damning words. "Cassian's blind. I'll take his place." Torren's face twisted with rage, but Jaxon's voice cut through. "Cassian's waiting. You're done." Torren lunged, claws flashing, but Jaxon met him head-on, their bodies crashing in a blur of fury. Elara pulled her family behind her, her magic flaring to form a shimmering barrier of light, deflecting a shifter's attack. The other guards hesitated, shaken by the recording, giving Elara the moment she needed. With a surge of power, she channeled her magic into a defiant chant, shattering the oath's hold. The spell broke with a force that left her gasping, freedom flooding her veins. As Jaxon pinned Torren, Cassian emerged from the pack house, his dark eyes blazing as Jaxon replayed the recording. "Seize him," Cassian commanded, his voice thunderous. Torren's men stood down, and he was dragged away, his betrayal laid bare. Dawn broke, painting the sky in soft golds and pinks, as Cassian faced Elara, his expression unreadable. "You're a witch," he said, his tone neutral but heavy. Elara stood tall, her family safe at her side, Jaxon's presence a quiet strength. "I am," she said, unflinching, "but I protected your pack." Cassian's gaze softened, the memory of her music and their shared moments lingering. "You've earned your place," he said. "Stay, as an ally, not a captive." Elara glanced at Jaxon, his subtle nod sealing her choice. "We'll stay," she said, her voice steady. "A new path unfolding, not just freedom, but a home where her magic could shine." Elara turned to the camera, her eyes bright with triumph, her voice warm and inviting, seamlessly weaving her story into an appeal. "Hey, you amazing souls who followed this journey from that dark apartment to this dawn of freedom! What a ride it's been!
I learned that courage means fighting for what matters, even when the odds are stacked against you. If this tale of breaking chains and finding strength resonated with you, hit that like button to show some love, share it with someone who needs a spark of defiance, and subscribe to join us for more epic stories of heart and rebellion. Your support keeps this magic alive. Let's keep telling tales that inspire. Catch you in the next adventure.